part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Thanks for downloading the Chase Smith Podcast, proudly part of the Press Play Podcast Network. This is episode 2 of my podcast mini-series, and I'm joined by Shā Sparks. She's the Chief Excitement Officer of her business, Spark of Fire International. Shā is a public speaker, life coach, and professional podcaster, and she joined me to talk about the influence of podcasts. And if anyone knows how to use this influence for good, it's Shā. Can't wait for you to hear her story. But before we get to the show, I want to highlight a new show on the Press Play Podcast Network, Podcast 616. This is our show all about Marvel content, movies, and television shows, hosted by the one and only Damon Royster. Damon will be your maker, watcher, overseer of all as he discusses all things Marvel. You can listen to this podcast right now on Apple Pods and Spotify. Well, maybe not right now. You got to listen to mine first. But then go check it out, Podcast 616. Damon is a writer, actor, and comedian out in LA, and he's just the best. Hilarious points of view, even funnier insight. Damon is a joy to listen talk about Marvel. We're lucky to have him with us. Damon, thank you so much. I'm going to add the trailer for Podcast 616 at the end of this prelude to give you a little sneak peek of what you can expect. Damon just reviewed in episode 1 WandaVision. In the next episode, he's going to be talking about Spider-Man No Way Home, all in preparation, leading us up to Doctor Strange 2 in the Multiverse of Madness. It's going to be epic. He's also going to be touching on Moon Knight, Thor Love and Thunder, and any other Marvel properties you can think of. Make sure to check that out right now, Apple Pods and Spotify. Podcast 616. Damon, thanks for all your work. It's going to be an incredible podcast. I can't wait to listen and be on it. It's going to be good stuff. I'm really enjoying this podcast mini-series. I recorded this in February, I think, actually. Yeah, it was quite a bit ago. But we're going to be talking about all sorts of things in podcasts. We're going to be talking about the art of storytelling. We're going to be talking about influence, as you noticed right here. We're going to be talking about the power of networks. And I just can't wait for you to listen to some of the people that I talked to and have gotten to know in the industry over the last 3 to 5 years. It's an incredible community. And podcasts, they're here to stay. They're not going anywhere. And so you might as well get to know them. Hope you guys enjoy this show. Here, check out Podcast 616, and then we'll get into my show. Thanks, everyone. See ya.
Hello and welcome to Podcast 616, the official podcast of Earth 616. I am your host, Damon Royster. A little bit about me. I am a writer, an actor, improviser, teacher, podcaster, and somehow still a disappointment to my family. They wanted me to be a lawyer, but instead, I love the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I love it so much that I am doing a dang podcast, y'all. Here it is. We're doing it now. I have been watching Marvel content for decades, from the MCU films, starting in 2008 with the first Iron Man movie. Even before that, I watched all the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, and before that, I was watching all the 1990 superhero cartoons on Fox Kids. I love it all. The characters and stories are just so mythic to me, but more than that, if I can get real for a second, they're all so human in Marvel. Every story comes from a human place that leads to some heartbreaking moment. I'm sure we can all remember when Spoiler, discovered Spoiler, and then Spoiler snapped Spoiler's fingers, and then Spoiler happened. Then, of course, Spoiler died. God, memorable moments, all of them. But there's also some really fun moments that happen. The baby Groot of it all, y'all. I truly believe that Marvel is a celebration of what superheroes fight for, and not an examination of how gritty superheroes can be, like some other comic book companies that shall remain nameless. We're talking about DC. But a little bit of the logistics of how this podcast works. On Podcast 616, our goal is to get you ready for the next big Marvel movie. Each week, I will have different comedians, actors, writers, and friends joining me to watch and discuss the movies, TV shows, and sometimes the trailers that are out there so we can all stay up to date with the ever-evolving world of the MCU. This will also be a safe space for Marvel fans and non-Marvel fans alike. Yes, believe it or not, there are people who are not fans of the MCU. It's bizarre, but it does happen. Each week, I will be joined by one Marvel expert and one Marvel newbie to get both perspectives on whether or not this movie or show works. A big worry I heard from a lot of MCU fans is whether or not casual viewers will get what's going on. But I've gathered these casual viewers here to ask them. This podcast is for everyone. This franchise is so fun, and I will attempt to break down that thick wall between nerd and regular humans. Finally, peace is on the horizon. I am so excited to get started and welcome all of you on this journey, this podcasting journey, brought to you by myself and the wonderful people at the Press Play Podcast Network, P3. That's our chant. So please subscribe now. We are starting with a very strange endeavor. Pause for laughter. We are starting with all the movies and shows that will get you ready for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness out this May in 2022. So yes, we're going to be talking about Spider-Man, Shang-Chi, and of course, everyone's favorite Scarlet Witch, Wanda. So please join us, listen, subscribe, and just let me know how I'm doing. And also remember that with great power comes great responsibility.
Thank you for downloading the Shā Smith Podcast, proudly part of the Press Play Podcast Network. In this episode, I interview Shā Sparks, Chief Excitement Officer of Spark of Fire International. We talk about our podcasting journeys, how she leverages her influence in podcasting, engaging content, and using your positive influence. Let's get it! Here with me, she is the Chief Excitement Officer of Spark Fire International, which is an umbrella company for all that she does. She is a certified fearless living coach. She is the host of the Power of Investing in People podcast, which is all about people following their dreams, stepping out and overcoming their fears, and kind of stepping out something dangerous and exciting. With me, Shā Sparks. Shā, what's up? It's good to see you. How you doing?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. No, I'm great. I'm great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. Shā, we first met, it was in the summer. We met at Podcast Movement, which is this huge annual podcast conference for everyone who, Shā, like us, we're just deep in the podcasting universe. And so we met and just really enjoyed our conversation, and then hearing what you do and why you do it and how you do it. It just captivated me. And as I've been developing this podcast mini series, I was like, man, I got to get Shā on, and one, to catch up, but two, I think this is incredible, and it fits right in. So Shā, thanks for coming on the Shā Smith podcast.
Well, thank you. Like I said, I'm totally honored to be a guest on your show. So thank you.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So Shā, before we get into podcasting, you're going to help speak to the influence of podcasts and maybe why that's attributed to the longevity of podcasting, and how that kind of relates in the audio form, all that influence that I think your show and you would be able to speak to. I want our people listening to get to know Shā a little bit. Okay. Shā, tell us about your journey in podcasting. What has been your experience what led you to Podcast Movement 2021, where we met?
Yeah. So I started my podcast about 3 years ago. And the reason I did is because I had been kind of searching podcasts to find the muck and the mire that we go through as entrepreneurs, right? What is it that we really have to hit rock bottom, so to speak, and then pull ourselves out of it by investing in ourselves, and then watching how naturally then it overflows onto our family, our business, and our community. And I wasn't finding that conversation anywhere. I was finding, oh, look at me, I'm a success story, it's an overnight success. Yes, I've had like maybe 3 years, and now here I am. I've had those kind of those podcasts out there, and I was like, man, there's got to be some realness to this, right? There's got to be some other people who are really talking about the grit, the determination, the willingness to go through the rock bottom and to continue to walk out of the fire, and use it as a refinement rather than to a discouragement. So that's kind of why I created the conversation, the power of investing in people. And it just kind of grew from there. I was just talking to friends I knew who are entrepreneurs, and it kind of grew from there into really talking to people who are entrepreneurs, but also leaders in the military industries and what they have gone through. So it's just fascinating to see how, it kind of grows and shifts and ebbs and flows, and as we all grow, right?
Yeah. I had my friend on, Tony McNeil, to talk about the networking of podcasting and how that is so important in this community. And I think you just touched on it there. you have, whether it's an issue or a drive or an idea, and you want to hear what other people have done with that. You want to find support, and you want to hear, hey, maybe try to avoid these pitfalls that I have experienced.
Yeah.
And Shā, it seems like you've been able to take some of that like authenticity and put it into your own stories. Was this something that, I mean, I'm sure it's been able to help you as you navigate starting your own businesses. And we were talking pre-show, you're like, yeah, I'm already retired from one, I'm doing another one. So you somehow have some type of, that was an awesome humble brag, by the way. I was like, man, that is, that is great. I'm sure you found that your own podcast has helped you in your own personal life.
Oh, absolutely. For sure. So podcasting is, first of all, it's a long form. It's a long game, right? It is not something immediate, it is not instant gratification whatsoever. But what the instant gratification that I get out of it is the conversation. And so the career that you mentioned that I just retired from, I'm a hairstylist, right? So I'm literally in the chair every day, or behind the chair every day, having great conversations with people who share their personal, their secret lives with me, right? Their secrets with me. And I've had this thing where I've been little. I was in the grocery store.
That could be an incredible podcast all in itself. Like tales from the, like whatever, like, and you just like recount, like, anyway, sorry, that just is brilliant.
It's so true. But it's funny because I'm just one of those people, I'm sure like you are too. People just tell you their secrets, right? They just, you say, hi, how are you? And next thing you know, you get their whole family story. And it's like, okay, well, there must be something to this, right? There must be something that I could do with this talent or skill or gift, if you will. I used to call it a curse, but now I call it a gift. And I thought, so I did get this all my career. So how can I take this, what I do, and at some point I need to transition and retire from one career and focus on something else. How can I take that into focusing on what's next? And for me, it was almost as if a no-brainer, like I'm coaching behind the chair. People are asking for my advice. So then podcasting, even though it sounds like it shouldn't go together, to me, it was a no-brainer. Coaching and podcasting automatically went together. And I don't know why. It just kind of like other people that I had seen. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
No, you're good. Well, I think because podcasting requires a certain amount of listening too, right? Especially as you interview and talk to people, like you have to listen, and you have to like actively listen. You can't just passively listen. You have to actively listen and engage and create this intimate conversation that allows people tuning into your conversation to feel like they're part of that conversation. And I'm sure as a hairstylist, which by the way, you didn't see me last. I bleached blonde my hair.
I wasn't going to mention, but yeah, no, it looks great.
Yeah. It happened in December, getting it done again in March. Actually, I think I'm going to be releasing all these episodes, dropping them all at once, Netflix style, in March. And so hopefully when this is released, it'll be done again. But just why not? It grows back. Something I've never like do the buzz bleach thing before. It's always, I've had the same like high whoosh brown for years. Anyway. So I think there is like this correlation between like listening and being engaging and then talking. So like it might sound like completely different mediums, but Shā, I think it makes sense. What came first, your podcast or the Spark of Fire International? Like your umbrella business, what came first?
Yeah, good question. So originally it was Sparks of Hope, and hope was something that I found that I needed out of coming out of an abusive relationship. I had lost hope. And so it was kind of the something that I aspired to. What do I hope to have in the future? And so it was Sparks of Hope. And in the summer of 2020, right after my brother's funeral, I had received a certified letter saying that I was having a cease and desist letter, that I needed to change the name of the business. So it became Sparks of Fire International. However, I always had that thought process of that there's an umbrella because there's all these different things that I want to do underneath it. So the idea of the umbrella kind of came first, but then I did coaching first and got my certification in that, and then started my podcast. And so And I didn't have necessarily a design, a strategy on why I chose one over the other. It just naturally fell into place in alignment, the way that I feel like God designed it to happen.
Yeah.
And I even wrote a book actually, even before the coaching.
Author. There you go.
So,
I should have mentioned that at the top.
so it's just kind of like how it all aligned.
Yeah.
Did I choose? No, it just fell into place.
Yeah. And I think that also gives you room to grow. I mean, if you want to be like a keynote speaker, or I think that could be like a natural evolution, right? Like, hey,
Absolutely. I'm a speaker. Yes.
Cool. That's awesome. It kind of, so with my network, it started with my podcast. And then I had someone I had never met on my podcast, this one, like 4 years ago, to talk about the Browns, and that was received incredibly well. And we had great chemistry right away. So we started our Browns, the Orange is Oranger podcast. And then all of a sudden 3 or 4 more podcasts were started, and it just kind of happened organically. But it is cool how, and Shā, you mentioned it, like we have this like passion, this hobby that all of a sudden isn't a hobby, right? It's not a hobby anymore.
Right?
It's become like it's consuming. And to me, that's exhilarating. I was talking to some of my students, and they said, "Hey, Chase, well, what do you do to relax and recharge?" And I was like, well, and I had to stop myself because it's not podcasting anymore. Like podcasting is its own like hours and upon hours and upon hours, like the grind. But I don't want to find anything else to recharge, because it's like, it is recharging. And it's hard to explain and describe, because I do have a full-time job. I do have a career outside of this. And I find myself a lot of times, like once the family's in bed, and like when I do have time to myself, it just, I naturally default to like podcasting. And it is kind of interesting how that is consuming. Shā, was that the first podcast movement you had been to this year, or have you been to others?
No. So I started it in 19. And so my first podcast movement was of 19. Okay. I had started my podcast in November of 18, and I did about 24 episodes weekly. And then I was burned out. I was like, okay, I have my coaching certification that I'm going through. I have the my business and podcasting, which, as you know, is not just an hour thing. It's a long process to edit and everything else when you're starting out and doing it yourself. And so I knew that I needed to just take a pause. Like, I'm just going to take a break. So I did 24 episodes. I went, you know what? That's a season. Okay. And now I'm going to come back. I knew that this was coming up when I had done that podcast movement. And I said, I'm going to go to that first, and maybe I'll find an editor or somebody to help me. And what I ended up happening is I met 300 of, now my best friends. And isn't that how it feels? Like you just meet, all of a sudden you meet as strangers, and you walk away, and all of a sudden you have this extended family. Yeah. And so the last day I met this gentleman who said, "Hey, what do you do for your coaching?" And I said, "Oh, I transform trauma into treasure." And he's like, "Oh, have you considered working with veterans?" And I was like, well, that's really funny, because I had a veteran on my first season. And after his episode, all these veterans kept showing up in my life, and they wanted me wanted me to interview them. And that's really crazy that you mentioned that. And I just became curious and explored that, like, well, what does that look like to work with veterans, and what does that mean, and what do I do? And just a series of events happened, and doors opened as soon as I kind of stepped into it and allowed that energy to come into my space. So between podcast movement and a month later, I was on Capitol Hill speaking to a Congresswoman's defense fellow, advocating for veterans. I didn't plan it. I wasn't strategic about it. It literally just one event happened, the door opened, and there I go. And here I am. And I feel like that's the way podcasting is too. It's like one conversation. Next thing you know, another door opens because they heard you on that interview, and they were like, "Oh, that was so amazing. I want you on mine," or co-host, or speaking, or whatever. So it's just fascinating, or a book. So it's just fascinating how podcasting world just opens up so many different avenues for you.
Yeah. Shā, hold that thought. We're going to take a quick break. Yes. Hold that thought. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to kind of like lean into that topic of the influence of podcasting. It's why I wanted you on the pod to talk about that exact thing. So just like the pro you are, just incredible segue. Stick around, Shā, and we'll be right back. Want to take a quick break to tell you about our good friends at Shart.com. Shart.com offers the very best t-shirt frames on the market. It's as simple as that. It's so good. Some call it art for your shirt. You know, shirt art. Shart. Shart.com is perfect for that shirt folded in the back of your drawer that is too sentimental to donate or throw away. Purchase one of these incredible frames ready to hang and display that shirt with pride. Shart's foam inserts and high-quality frames prevent you from having to cut your shirt and will keep your memory safe and beautiful for years to come. It comes fully assembled with turn buttons, real glass sealed in place for safe shirt framing, and 2 sawtooth hangers nailed to the back of the frame so you can mount your piece of Shart either horizontally or vertically. Shart acts as a great decoration for your home, retail store, office, bar, restaurant, school, gym, shop, man cave, and even studios. It's super simple and easy to set up. Look, I love this so much. I have 5 of them. I really do. I'm telling you, they're fantastic. And partnering with us, now they can offer you the very best prices on the very best t-shirt frames available. Only for the Shā Smith podcast listeners, you can use promo code CHASE to save $5 off an order of the original 11x14 black frame. Limit 1 use per customer. The offer is good through the end of March. Again, that promo code is CHASE at checkout to save $5. Go to Shart.com today to begin your order.
Hey everyone, it's JD from the Hyman Podcast. Backed by popular demand, I'm excited to let you know that new episodes of the Hyman Podcast will drop every other Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're going to continue the conversations we started last season and keep having those hard conversations. There is so much in store for you this season, and I'm excited to share it with you. Subscribe today so you don't miss a single moment. The Hyman Podcast, part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello, this is Don Mike Mendoza, the host of the Producing While Asian podcast. Join us to listen in on conversations with everyone who identify from producers to non-producers who all are part of the AAPI community. There's all that and more on the Producing While Asian podcast here on the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello, Brooks here with the Books with Brooks monthly book club podcast. Listen, it is beyond time for you to join a book club. I know you've been thinking about it and everyone's doing it. Here's how Books with Brooks works. We read 1 book a month and then we talk about it. Classics like Stephen King's The Shining, debut novels like We Are the Brennans by Tracy Lang, and tons of other compelling, life-changing stories, 1 book and 1 month at a time. So come read along with us and then listen in.
All right, we are back on the Shā Smith podcast here with the wonderful Shā Sparks. So we're talking about the influence of podcasting, and Shā just shared this incredible story of the influence that she found as she was navigating podcasting, and not only the influence that she was able to have, but the influence that guests were able to have on her show through helping veterans. Shā, when you were bringing on veterans to work through this hope, you said something at the first block. You said transforming tragedy into triumph, which is
trauma into treasure.
Trauma into treasure. Sorry, I got my T's. I think I felt like the theme was right. I had the wrong.
Yes, it is. It is. Yeah.
So wait, now I'm confused. Transform
trauma into
treasure. And finding the power of influence podcasting has. Did you find that as you were interviewing people in your show, or did you find that more in people reaching out saying, oh my gosh, Shā, that interview was exactly what I needed, or oh my gosh, I went through that same scenario, or this was so helpful? Where have you found the most influence? Is it in the moment talking to those people who are sharing these incredibly broken, like intimate moments, or is it in the response to those and the influence you can have there?
Great question. I think it's both, actually. And it started when I was coaching. Like, I would see where they had, experienced some sort of trauma. And when I say trauma, it's We've all experienced some sort of trauma.
Mhm.
It's not that we're defining it that way. It's our brain defines it that way, right? And so it's how can you make the most of what's happened to you and realize that that happened for you, not to you.
Mm.
And so I would just have those conversations in coaching. And then I would have the conversation on the interview in the podcast on their circumstance that happened, right? And it was like, wow, so now that you've done this or gone through this, experienced this, you invested in yourself to overcome that. And now it naturally overflows onto your business. And now you've created this whole other entity for yourself or nonprofit or whatever. And everyone was like, wow, that like mind blown. I hadn't thought about it that way. And then it went into my audience. They would reach out to me and they're like, oh my gosh, I never thought about, the experience that I had at this corporate level, the job, or the experience I had in the military could really propel me to do something greater in the future rather than holding me back.
Right.
And so for me, that's really why it was like, that's what recharges me, is when I get those kind of those conversations back, or that feedback, back to me, where it's like, oh my gosh, what you just talked about made such a huge difference.
Yeah. And that's like completely like life-changing. Like people
Yeah.
feel completely trapped in trauma or in whatever situations that they find themselves in. And to have this like alternative perspective, or to hear someone even like speak power to that is life-changing. Shā, what do you have like an example? Can you give like, without, I mean, you don't have to say names, but maybe there's an episode where you're like, yo, that was fire.
Well, they're all fire, right? And they're all my
Yes.
favorites. Everybody's like, who's your favorite guest? I'm like, my God, they're all my favorites. Yeah. So one of my friends, or in the early days when I interviewed her, she had just experienced a huge loss. She became a widow in her early 40s. And because, she went through the grieving process, and she really knew that, she needed counseling and she needed help. And she just started, she's a platform too. She's a speaker. And she started to really put herself out there and talk about the pain that she was experiencing of grieving the loss of her husband. And which, as you can already tell, I mean, what a heavy subject, because it was completely out of the blue, unexpected. And it was, extremely difficult for her. And what happened then is she took what people had come to her and said, because of you, your story made me think differently, or look for a grief counselor, or, different things. She then said, well, what if I started kind of it's not a nonprofit yet. At some point she will put it into, I think, as a nonprofit, but what if I just had a program around Valentine's Day to love on women because their spouse is gone? And to have that kind of then power to share it on my platform, people were reaching out going, man, I wish I had lived there. I would have loved to be a part of that. I wonder if there's anything in my community like that. So then she, in her community, wherever she was, because I can't remember, she reached out or created her own. So it became a ripple effect. And that's literally what all of this is, right? We just share what happens, and then it becomes a ripple effect to create the change, the greater good that we want to see in the world.
Why do you think podcasts have this influence, Shā? Like, why did that happen? What do you think it is about what we do and hearing other people share? Like, what about, like, how's it possible?
So first of all, it's kind of the difference between watching a movie and listening and reading a text in a phone call. Podcasts are extremely intimate because of the sound of our voices, because of how we're telling our story. You're able to hear it as if you're watching a dramatic movie, suspenseful movie, comedic movie, right? You're feeling it, you're hearing it, right? Reading a text or reading a book, you make it up. So you're missing that whole audible in the brain. So I think it becomes a very intimate moment in our storytelling, is because we're connecting straight to the brain, because most of us listen to it either in the car or with earbuds in or earpods in, that you're literally, it's straight to the brain. So I think that's why it's created such this beautiful conversation that's almost as if, especially in my world, in my conversations, kind of like yours too, it's like two friends catching up over coffee, right? So we get as kind of a like eavesdrop, right? We get to listen to a conversation that's being had. So I think that's kind of the difference with podcasting than any other platform.
I agree. I think there's magic to hearing emotion behind a voice, pace of a conversation, rhythm of thought, and then even the vulnerability of intimacy and sharing, like being transparent, saying, hey, like when I was 13 years old, this happened, or, hey, this is why marriage is really hard, or, hey, we had a hard time, getting pregnant, or, hey, like my parents or my, like, I think there's so much power in transparency, because you can hear the vulnerability. You can hear almost the hesitation of maybe someone sharing who hasn't shared before. Shā, I know there are things that I would love to share. I'm in full-time ministry. So I've been in full-time ministry for 13 years. And there are things, Shā, that me and my wife have had to like work through. So our perspective of the church doesn't get jaded. So our faith doesn't get jaded. And part of me would love to share, and part of me would be like, hey, if you share, it's going to like those ripple effects might not be the most positive thing, for numerous reasons. But so yeah, I do think there is this incredible thing, this connection that happens when you are privy to this one-on-one conversation and you hear someone say, hey, like, this is really scary, but this is my experience, this is what happened, and this is how we've worked through that. And all of a sudden I'm sharing, and oh my gosh, I didn't realize that this is what that could look like. And all of a sudden someone listening, or the host, is like, that's really cool too. Shā, do you go into interviews with like an agenda or an idea, or do you allow them to kind of naturally evolve, or do you kind of try to do the best of both worlds?
All the above. So I go in and I ask the first question of, what does investing in people mean to you? And every single person has a completely different answer, which has been amazing. I'm about to start the 5th season, and it's literally like every single person's different. But then I also go into taking from what they say. So he brings in that active listening, like you talked about in the beginning, taking about what they say and then picking up whatever it is they said and go, oh, well, here's a thread, and we're going to go from there. So I just did one a couple of hours ago, and it was about connection, right? Or it's about leadership, or it's about, how did you know you're an entrepreneur? So it depends on what the conversation, what they said. And then I go from there. And there are times where I have specific questions, but most of the time it just naturally comes out in the conversation. And I think what's so fascinating, and I try to meet every guest, or at least, video call with them or talk to them on the phone first, because what I find so fascinating is that we all have some sort of trauma. And it is, I always say that I am a safe space for you to talk about it. And if there's nothing if you're not ready to talk about it, then let me know. We won't go there. And I had one woman share with me how she was sexually abused by a family member. And she's like, I cannot believe I'm saying this. And then when it came out, I'm like, are you sure you're ready for this? And she's like, absolutely. And then she had people reach out to her. It was like, I had no idea. Thank you for sharing your story. That helps me share my story. Incredible. And again, and it's real, it's raw, it's authentic, it's genuine. And I think that's what our world is lacking. Especially with the, you use the word for influence, especially in the influencer, quote unquote, world that we're living in, that everything is perfect. Right. And as a pastor of a church, there's only one perfect person. And then that happened on this world. Right. And so let's talk about, the real stuff
Mhm.
and that we've survived and we're okay.
Yeah.
And
We're
if
all-
we can do it, so can you.
We're all trying to figure this out together. And
Yes.
there's no point in trying to, portray a perfect fill in the blank. It doesn't exist.
No.
And I think you're spot on there, Shay. I'm glad I had you on to talk about influence. I mean, I think I think you got a pretty
Yes.
good idea of what we're talking about here. Where do you see the future of podcasts and influence going? Because I'm personally not super surprised at where we are with podcasting. I remember podcasting, finding out about a podcast in 2006. And I was like, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, this is like a la carte radio. This is incredible. And I think that speaks to the influence too, because you have someone like, hey, I have an organ transplant. I have no clue, but I would probably almost guarantee if you go to like any podcast platform and look up like some type of like transplant, whatever transplant you want, there's going to be a story or a podcast, or there's probably something for whatever issue or hobby or like thing that you want to find. And that's incredible influence, because now all of a sudden they don't have to be anyone. It could just be some random person's thoughts on, hey, I had an appendectomy. This was my experience. And all of a sudden it's just like, well, I don't know who this is, but this was their experience. And that's a whole nother level of influence, Shay, for better or worse, right? People can share influence in a negative way. And we're recording this in the beginning of February. And so Spotify and Rogan is all over like the news. And I'm not going to get into political, but you're just seeing like, how much influence do we want to portray? How much influence do we want to be responsible for? How much influence is a good thing? Is a bad thing? Like, where is the line of influence? And it's just fascinating. And I don't think you can, like, I think it's a very interesting conversation to have. And I would much rather have the conversation of like what kind of influence leads to hope and leads to these like kind of like positive life moments, because I think that's it's not unique to podcasting, but I think podcasting is a really incredible space for that to happen, Shay.
I do too. And I love that you mentioned who you mentioned, because so for me, I see it as, when I was watching it, it was internet radio. It wasn't technically called a podcast, but I've just been observing how it's ebbed and flowed over the last, decade or longer. And I saw where statistic literally over the weekend, I think it's 2.5 or, almost 3 million podcasts out there, and there's less than 500,000 active.
Yeah.
And yet you listen to Rogan, you listen to Tim Ferriss and Brene Brown, and you listen to these people and they will have a sponsored ad, John Lee Dumas, right? And they get their sponsored ad. And I think, talk about influence, things are shifting where when you watch the Super Bowl, you're like, oh, so because I'm from Kansas City and they should have been in there, but that's a whole other thing. I will say, let's say the Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes, he is on State Farm commercials, right? But so you think, okay, so if there's any scandal that ties in with State Farm, is Patrick Mahomes going to take responsibility for that endorsement, right? But then you see the Super Bowl and Pepsi. So Pepsi has a scandal. Well, then does the whole Super Bowl? Do you see what I mean? So it takes away, it almost makes the person, the podcaster as an influencer, as responsible for the brands that they work with. And yet it's just a brand. Yeah.
I'm much more interested, I think we both are, in like the personal influence and impact podcasting and like these kind of conversations can have. I just leave those other conversations where they're at, and they'll figure it out. There's an answer somewhere that I'm sure they will. Well, Shay, this has been so great. This has been life-giving for me. It's been great to see and catch up. I don't know if we're sending a team to Podcast Movement this year or not. But if we do, I will definitely let you know, Shay, for sure.
Yes, please. And I would love to have you on mine as well. So we'll have to schedule that.
Yeah, definitely. We'll make that happen. Well, that does it for this episode of the Chase Smith Podcast. Thank you all so much for downloading and listening. Shout to the Press Play Podcast Network for making this possible. You can follow us online at Press Play Pods. Visit our website at pressplaypodcast.com to keep up with all of our shows, network news, and new feature written content. We're writing articles. Check it out, pressplaypodcast.com. And that does it. Shā, plug something. Where can we find you? Tell us about all that you're doing. Let's get some plugs in there.
All that I'm doing. Awesome. So the Power of Investing in People podcast with Shā Sparks. That's every platform. Apple, Spotify, all the big ones. You can also find me on all the social media at I am Shā Sparks. Facebook, Shā Sparks, and that's SHA Sparks. And then my website is shasparks.com. I also have a Firestarters book project that I am the co-founder of, and that has actually several podcasters, influencers in it. And it is a co-author book where we really come together and be the change that we want to see in the world. And I also have, what else do I have? I'm like, is that it? That's it for now. So we'll put it that way. But yeah, I would love to hear from anyone, and you can always reach out on social media.
Love it. Love it. Love it. All those links will be in the show notes. Shā, thank you so much. It's so great to see you and catch up. You have a great winter and spring.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be on.
Yep. Thanks, Shā. Bye.